Hello. Let me just get my screen shared here and we'll get going. Hang on, I lost my PowerPoint. Okay. Let's get this guy going. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. Let's see. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on eating disorders. I'm Dr. Trish Leigh. I'm glad to be here with you tonight. I'm going to get going right away so that we can make good use of our time. I just wanted to remind you that the chat box is open, so you can ask any questions you'd like, and I'd be happy to answer them at the end. And I can see them coming in, so if you have a thought as I get rolling, I'd love for you to be able to put your question in, and I'd be happy to answer. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about eating disorders, and we're mainly going to talk about causes, and then I'm going to share some action steps with you. And it's really important that you're here with me tonight, and I really want to be here because people do not know that at the root of eating disorders are irregular brain patterns, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time on. And at our office, Leigh Brain and Spine, we help a lot of people who have challenges with food. And it really doesn't have much to do with food. It has everything to do with kind of reward and stress within the brain. And I'm going to show you how over the course of the next half hour so that we can spend our time well. Okay, so first of all, let's just start off by characterizing eating disorders. And really, I always call everything challenges with instead of disorders of. So I consider it to be a challenge surrounding food. And we're primarily going to talk about compulsive or binge eating versus anorexia and look at those two main patterns. Quickly, we'll peek into bulimia because it tends to be a combination of those two brain patterns. So when we think of binge eating or eating too much, and the definition of it is loss of control that results in overeating, what is at the root of compulsive eating is a brain pattern that has to do with stress. So compulsions, what are compulsions? Compulsions are the feeling that you need to do something, and it's a nagging feeling that you need to do something. This is versus impulsivity. Impulsivity is you have a quick thought, I'm going to do that thing, and you just do it right away. So stress and compulsive behaviors come out of an anxiety brain type. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute. Impulsive behaviors, kind of reacting quickly and not necessarily thinking about it, that comes out of an ADHD brain type. So just to back us up, if you haven't watched any of my videos, I have a few video series on YouTube. And if you haven't heard me talk before, I'm just going to back us up real quick to how brains work overall. And I know many people have heard me say this before, and there's videos on my YouTube channel, but I'm going to give you the quick 1-minute version. The 1-minute version is that our brains have 5 speeds that they are supposed to be able to shift between. Those 5 speeds get us into the states that we need or want to be in throughout our day. So extra slow speed, which is called delta, is very slow. It's 2 cycles per second. That is the speed that keeps you asleep. Slow speed is 5 cycles. It's a little bit faster. It shifts you into sleep. Medium speed is at 10 cycles per second. That's chill mode or couch mode, as I call it. So what it means is you're hanging out and you're fully awake, but you're not really thinking. A little bit faster at 15 cycles per second is thinking mode. So it's calm focus. It's where you want to be if you have focused attention. And even faster, extra fast speed is around 30, 35 cycles per second, very fast. That is stress mode or overdrive, as I call it. That creates fight or flight. It's designed so that we as human beings can get out of a stressful situation quickly by kicking our system into overdrive, but it's not designed to stay there, and our systems really can't sustain all that extra fast energy. So that's how our brains are supposed to work. We're supposed to be able to shift in and out of those 5 speeds across our day and across our life. What happens is brains get stuck in speeds. So a brain can get stuck in anxiety mode, which is tons of extra fast speed. A brain can get stuck in extra slow mode, which is an ADHD type of brain. And a brain can get stuck in both of them. So we're going to look at that just a little bit more throughout our time here, and specifically how that can impact food and a relationship with food. Okay, so hopefully you understand what binge eating is. It's both. It's mainly a stress pattern, but it also has a component of that ADHD impulsive pattern. It's mostly compulsions. Okay, so when we're thinking about bulimia, and we're really not going to cover too much, but hopefully you'll be able to put the 2 pieces of the pie from the extremes together, it's a binge and purge type of situation. So it's a loss of control surrounding eating. It too has to do with a stress and compulsivity brain type and an impulsivity brain type, which we're going to break down. Anorexia is different in that it is lack of nutrition, and it's an aversion to eating, and it really comes from an anxiety brain pattern. It doesn't have much of that impulsivity component to it, and it's surrounding the idea of low self-esteem and anxiety, which then has been triggered with food. So let's keep going. Okay, so these are really considered food addictions, and there's a lot of science that shows that food addictions can be are similar brain patterns to substance addictions and to sex addictions. And if you just think about it logically, the addiction is the way that it makes you feel and what's happening within the brain. And then it just depends what the triggers are that have been associated with it. So for some people, it's sexual behavior. For other people, it's substance abuse or drinking. And for other people, it's been triggered around food. And it's a little bit different for each, but it tends to be very similar. So compulsive thoughts. Let's break down the compulsive thought. What a compulsive thought is that there's a trigger that makes you feel like you need to do or not do a certain action. And the action is actually a way to calm the way that the brain feels. So the brain feels out of sort because whatever's happening within it, which I'm going to show you in just a second, but to be able to calm that feeling, the compulsive or addictive behaviors have to happen to make the brain feel okay for a little while. So the area that's mainly implicated in challenges surrounding food is an area called FZ. And I know that that slide is tiny, but what I want to show you is that it's this area up here in the middle of the frontal lobe. It's frontal, which is what the F is for, and Z means at midline in the middle. This area underneath, which you can see on the brain picture that's on this slide, is called the anterior cingulate gyrus. So what happens in that area, if it's running too slow, like in an ADHD pattern, and too fast, like in an anxiety pattern, it's craving stimulation to speed it up, which has to do with it running too slow. And that stimulation is anxiety or stress, which has to do with the fast pattern. And it's this area that needs it. So basically it needs stimulation, and then to feed it that stimulation, it has compulsive thoughts that speed the brain up, and it can't feel better until it acts out in a certain way to be able to feel better. And that's primarily how compulsive eating or compulsive not eating occurs. And I'm going to show you the picture of the left-hand side image of the brain with all those circles and the letters and numbers again in a minute, because this is an international system that brain professionals use to be able to identify what's happening within a person's brain. All the letters and numbers are specific areas of the brain, and each one has a specific job or skill or ability that it's in charge of. And we're going to look at this again in just a minute. So hopefully you're getting the idea of what's happening within the brain when it comes to a relationship with food. Okay, let's talk about ADHD for a minute, because most people don't know this, and I've already talked about the ADHD brain pattern a few times, but it's important to know that people with ADHD are 3.8 times more likely to suffer from an eating disorder than those without ADHD. People with eating disorders are 2.8 times more likely to have ADHD. So that relationship goes in both directions, which is not always the case when it comes to the science, looking at brain patterns. The idea is people who have an ADHD brain pattern, one that craves stimulation, are much more at risk for eating disorders because their brain kicks it into overdrive with stress surrounding food to feed the brain the stimulation that it desires. So when we work with people with eating challenges in our office, many times we see that ADHD pattern is there, whether the person was aware of it or not, and always the anxiety pattern is there. And we're able to see that on a brain map. Okay, so eating disorders and impulsivity, which relates back to the ADHD pattern, is a strong behavior, especially when it comes to binge eating and bulimia, because we've already said those two have the impulsive piece, where you feel a need right away and you act on that need right away. And children with ADHD tend to have very impulsive behavior. So we know, the science shows that young people who have ADHD, over 50% of them are being treated for obesity. 24.7% of the people being treated for obesity have ADHD, and there's extreme obesity in 46.2%. So the idea is ADHD brain patterns are at the root of binge eating and then subsequently bulimia too. And it's that impulsive need to feed that stimulation of the brain. The brain needs a stimulation, and thoughts surrounding food feed it in terms of that fast pattern, and then food itself feeds it. We're going to break it down even further though. Okay, so let me just look here real quick. Okay, so eating disorders and anxiety. Anxiety is the primary driving force behind the brain patterns that are associated with eating challenges. And we've already talked about the compulsive behaviors that make the brain feel calmer. We're going to look at this specifically in terms of stress and anorexia. And this picture, hopefully you can see it okay, and even if you just get the general idea of it, is very, very powerful. So what happens is, for people who have a typical relationship to food, when a person feels hungry, they go, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to go get some food. And knowing that they're going to get food creates a trigger of the reward mechanisms of neurotransmitters in the brain. And that's basically what this picture shows on the left-hand side. So I'm like, I'm hungry, I'm going to go get some food. Knowing I'm going to get food and then having food sets off the pleasure centers in my brain, especially if it's good food. And I then can eat and feel satiated and feel good because I've just been able to eat when I was hungry. If I have a typical brain pattern and I don't have any of the irregular brain patterns that have to do with eating challenges, then I don't need to overeat and I don't need to undereat or avoid eating. I can just eat the proper amount, feel full, and move on without thinking about food until the next time I feel hungry. What happens in anorexia is the pleasure centers and the neurotransmitters for feeling good, dopamine and serotonin, they are not set off in a cascading effect when it is time to eat. What happens is the person feels hungry, and that sets off the trigger of the stress response, which is the opposite of what we want to happen. So feeling hungry and then needing to have food creates stress in the person, which then restricts food because that's what they feel like they need to do. And then what it does is it alters that dopamine reward center, and it's actually cortisol, which is the stress neurotransmitter, is set off, which perpetuates the person not eating. And food is the trigger, but it's not really the thing that is at the root. What's at the root is it's triggered the stress response which then makes it all but impossible for the person to eat. So when I talk to families and I try to explain the way that the brain's working in eating disorders, very important to me to try to communicate to people that this response is very real at the physiological level. It's not just in the person's head. It's real, which means it's almost impossible for them to eat. And I'm going to share some suggestions at the end on how to get the ball rolling in the right direction. But it's difficult if the brain is still in this irregular brain pattern. So hopefully you understand when there's a typical or a good relationship to food, it sets off the reward pleasure centers and you feel good when you eat just enough. And in brains that have anorexia or aversion to food, the stress response is set off and it makes it impossible to eat. Really, what has been found to be at the root, I'm just checking my notes to make sure I talked about everything. What has been found to be at the root is a loss of control. So that is something that should be worked at with a mental health professional. At Lee Brain and Spine, we have a psychotherapist who works on our team so we can really help people, because that control issue needs to be figured out, why the person doesn't feel like they have control and what can happen for them to feel in control again. And so when they don't eat, it gives them a sense of control, which then makes their world feel better, which then calms their nervous system. And if you've spoken with me before, control tends to be at the root of a lot of challenges that people have. And I had a few conversations in the office today just talking about trying to figure out what's going on in a person's life and give them back a modicum of control within situations that feel out of control for them. And when it comes to anorexia, that tends to be at the root of it too. And just another point is everything I tell you, I'm just the messenger. It's supported by science. So this is an illustration from Nature magazine, and there's studies that prove what I am telling you is true. Okay, so let's keep going here. Binge eating disorder. Again, I don't totally love that. I think compulsive, love that name, but I mean, it communicates it, but I feel like a compulsion to eating tends to be a better way of talking about the feelings that a person has. So again, when it comes to binge eating or compulsions, it's a very similar brain pattern to people who abuse substances and have other addictions. So we talked about that frontal lobe, and I showed you the area FZ in the middle. Now we're talking about the whole frontal lobe when it comes to overeating or binge eating or compulsions for eating. So we're talking about this area here, which is F4, and this area here, which is F3, the whole frontal lobe. This area, F3, is involved in attention. So basically, this is the area that's really implicated in ADHD or ADD. So when it comes to food and food challenges, this area, F3, has increased motivated attention when it comes to food. And there's studies that show that this area of the brain lights up when food is present for people who have difficulty not thinking about food, people who have compulsive behaviors where they think about food and they want to eat a lot and either overeat or binge eat or just can't control their eating as well as they would like to. At the same time, this area over here, which is for impulsivity control and judgment, it's overactive also with this fast brain speed. So the brain just gets much more excited about food than typical brains. It has much more motivated attention, and it lacks impulsivity control surrounding food at the physiological level. So again, I try to communicate to people that this is what's happening in the brain, and the brain pattern is driving the behaviors, and that's proven by science. It's not all in your head. It is, literally, but it's not something that you just are thinking surrounding food. This stuff is real, and it's happening at the neurological level. So again, there's changes in dopamine neurotransmitter release, but this time it's the opposite. There's higher reward thresholds and a decrease in dopamine release. So more and more food and more time thinking about food and eating food is necessary to hit the reward levels and the thresholds that a person who has a typical relationship to food would have. So to break that down into just easy terms, So I just think about food for a little while, and then I eat, and then I'm done thinking about food, and my reward centers are lighting up, and I'm feeling good because I just had a great meal, but then those levels all even out. For a person whose brain is operating in this mode, they're thinking about food much longer. Those levels are much higher. They need a lot more food and a lot more time with it to set off the same levels as a person with typical food relationship. So again, this is happening at the neurological level. Okay, so what can be done about it? Of course, as a major proponent of neurofeedback and brain mapping, which is half the reason I'm here, not selfishly, I want to motivate people to figure out what their brain is doing. I'm going to give you some tips, so don't go anywhere. I'm going to tell you what you can do without getting your brain mapped. But I really believe that anybody who's struggling with an eating disorder really should have their brain mapped. With the families that we've worked with, and I'm going to show you some slides that won't make a ton of sense to you until I explain them to you in a minute. The families that we work with families in a comprehensive team. So it's not like you just get your brain mapped and you get neurofeedback and everything gets better. But what does happen is when you have your brain mapped and you know what's going on, you can actually see what is at the root of your challenges surrounding food. It's real. You can see it there. And it will presumably look something like what I've just shown you, because that's the pattern that's proven by science. Once you know you have that pattern, first of all, it gives you back that control that I was talking about. People who have challenges with eating and eating disorders really feel like they have a loss of control in the situation. So when you get control back and you know there's something you can do about it, things get better first and foremost. But this is all proven by science. So as your brain improves, and I'm going to show you how with neurofeedback therapy in just a second, all the other therapies and all the other people you work with, their skills work better now because your brain is in a better pattern and it can actually do the things that they're telling you. So if you work with a mental health professional and they're telling you to use these strategies to rewire your brain and reboot your brain, if it's really jammed in a pattern, it would be all but impossible for you to do that just using the strategies. So once your brain's in a better pattern, now you can do what they've told you. If you work with a nutritionist and they're giving you strategies to be able to eat more and to eat healthy foods, now you're able to eat better because we changed that stress response and we changed the way that the neurotransmitters are firing at the neurological level. I'm going to show you how in just a second. But we're revisiting this 10-20 system, which is that picture, because we can see on a brain map, and here's a picture of me brain mapping a young man. That's my son, Seamus. My kids tend to be my stunt models, if you don't know. My husband and I work together. My husband's name's Cosmos, and we have 6 children, so a lot of the pictures have our kids in it. If you have 6 kids, you might as well use them as your neurofeedback models, right? But so you can see how on the cap that Seamus is wearing that there's sensors. The white areas are sensors, and I'm putting a little bit of gel into each one of the sensors. The sensors read what your brain is doing, how it's performing, how it's using electrical energy, which is the speeds that I was talking about. It just reads information. It doesn't do a thing to you, but it's basically like an X-ray of your brain showing you how your brain is performing and what needs to be done for it to perform better, which means your symptoms go down. And what it shows us is there's a sensor on every single one of these circles that you see on this brain map head. So we're able to see every area and how it's performing and what's necessary for it to work better. These are the graphs that I know will make no sense to you, but I wanted to be able to show you quickly, and these are real graphs from a real young lady with an eating disorder, anorexia, and I wanted to let you know that when you have neurofeedback therapy in the mix, it produces measurable results. So every time someone comes into our office, our neurofeedback systems generate what is called in the business a trend graph. So it shows us how your brain is performing within and across every single session. So we are able to see if those changes are happening. And what we see on the first graph up to the left-hand side is that this person's brain is using too much slow processing speed. That's the black line. You can see it starts above 50. We want it starting below 30 to be within normal limits. At the same time, you can see that one side of the brain, the yellow line, which is hard to see, that the yellow line is higher. And that means that that person is using an anxiety brain pattern. You can see it here if you're able to. What we see a great response to training, the black line trains down across the session. Here it takes a break. I always use an analogy of doing a plank. So basically her brain was able to hold a plank here and it had to take a break and it went back in for another plank. This is the most recent session, and the coolest thing is that you can see these peaks up and down, which is training, but you can also see that the brain started just at 30. We're no longer on a 50-point scale. And I know it's comparing apples to oranges, but I wanted to be able to show you this. At the same time, the yellow lines are lower. And of course, it has to produce measurable results in terms of a person's behavior. So this person got so much better and they were able to eat food. They still had feelings of compulsion around not eating, but they were eating healthy, gained weight, and thriving. Instead of when they joined us, they were in a downward spiral and really moving in the wrong direction. So it's all measurable. It produces measurable results. We have people on this webinar from across the country, so it's not just in my office. If you are working with a reputable neurofeedback practitioner, which I like to call neurofeedback experts, if you're working with someone with high quality system and high quality skills, their system is going to produce these trend graphs for you to be able to measure progress, and they're going to know how to measure that progress for you and to share it with you, which is what we do. Okay, so I wanted to be able to share some do-it-yourself strategies because I wanted to be able to, first of all, tell you, if you get your brain mapped, that's step number one, you'll know what's going on, and you'll be able to make decisions moving forward, and it will be an essential part of your care program of getting better and staying better forever using neurofeedback so that your brain's in a better spot and can go to work doing all the things that your other professionals are telling you. So hopefully you have other professionals in the loop. But if you don't, and this is your first thought, and I know there's a lot of people, it's very difficult for people to get help for themselves if they are caught in this negative feedback loop, which I'm going to explain in just one second. But it is very important that you start using some of these strategies and trying really hard to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So, because you can rewire your own brain, but if your brain is really jammed in one of these modes, which it presumably is, it's very difficult to get the ball rolling. That's the role that neurofeedback plays. It breaks a negative feedback loop and it begins to create a positive feedback loop. So let me tell you what a negative feedback loop is, and then I'll tell you how you can shift that yourself. And again, I'll tell you how neurofeedback does that for you. Okay, so a negative feedback loop basically comes from the brain patterns that I'm talking about. The brain pattern itself is creating the need to eat or not eat. So in the example here, I'm talking about overeating or compulsions with food. The negative brain pattern is one that feels stressed, and it basically is telling itself if it eats food, it's no longer going to feel as stressed. And of course, it only works for a little while, but the compulsion is to eat something so that that feeling of stress goes away. The negative behavior is you eat a lot to help that feeling go away. That's coming from the brain pattern. And then, of course, it has negative outcomes. So there's weight gain, you feel terrible. It actually triggers a guilt and shame cycle. And if you look that up, it's mind-blowing. It makes you feel guilty about your behaviors. You feel shameful, and so you don't want to share it with anybody else. And it actually perpetuates the first brain pattern. So there's a scientific law called Hebb's law that proves that the more you use a negative brain pattern, it is hardwiring itself in. It's locking itself in. So what we do with neurofeedback is we gently shift that negative brain pattern to a more positive brain pattern using neurofeedbacks, and we can track the progress with the graphs we just showed you. Then what we encourage people to do, and we try to empower them and inspire them to establish a positive feedback loop. So as your brain pattern is getting stronger and healthier, It feels less stress. It doesn't feel the need to use the compulsive behavior to eat a lot to help it feel less stress, because it feels less stress in the first place. You have better control. Remember, that's an important word, to execute better behaviors. So I put eat an apple and peanut butter because when I feel like I've spent too many nights eating chips, or even I eat nothings and hummus, but even sometimes I feel like, okay, I've eaten too many chips sitting on the couch. My go-to is to eat apples and peanut butter because it's still a little salty and sweet. And yeah, it's definitely not as satiating as salt and vinegar kettle chips, but the idea is that that is an actual thing that I know to do. It's a habit. And so then I'm able to execute the better behavior so that then I get better outcomes. So any day I make that choice to have apples and peanut butter instead of chips, the next day I feel better. I will have weight loss instead of weight gain. I have more energy because I've eaten food that's nourishing. I feel confident because I made a better choice yesterday. And something I do in my life, and it has to do with food also, is that I try to do as many positive behaviors on any given day because I know that that is going to impact how I feel on the next day. So I'll try to drink lots of water. I'll try to make good food choices. I'll try to get in bed early. And I try to have a lot more positives than I have negatives. I try to keep the negatives as minimal as possible so that the next day I can feel confident because I know I've had a lot of good behaviors the day before. And really what it does is it literally creates a positive feedback loop. If you can establish a positive feedback loop, and this is how neurofeedback works, it will continue to perpetuate itself in a flywheel motion. So if you can get it going, it'll keep itself going because of what I've just told you. You'll have a better brain pattern. It will make you have better behaviors, which will get you better outcomes, which will go back and lock it in with Hebb's Law. So it might be difficult to use if this is your first step on your journey. And that's why brain mapping and possibly neurofeedback could be really beneficial for you because you would know what your brain needs. But if you can start using these strategies, and a strategy for anorexia is the same thing, and I have it on the next slide, I'll get there in just 1 second, but is to establish a positive feedback loop with eating a little, eat enough to be healthy, and try to, and I know it's hard, and that's why I say try, to have a positive response to food. So on the next slide, and this is the last slide, I promise you, because our time is just about up, we want to use something called scaffolding. Scaffolding is a therapeutic technique. So when you can see I put a picture of a building, you could never build floor number 5 without scaffolding or without building floor number 1 first. So what the technique means is you have to start with small wins at the ground level. So, that might be an apple or peanut butter, or for someone who drinks, I tell people, I have a lot of people in that we work with in the office that feel the need to drink 2, 3, 4 drinks a night. Habit replacement of trying to get themselves down to 1 drink a night and then a cup of tea and then just a cup of tea. It's moving themselves in the right direction with small wins instead of trying to change a 4-night-a-drink habit into a 0-night a drink a night habit, because that's just too far of a gap. You need scaffolding to build success for yourself. So if not eating, if having an aversion to eating is what is going on with you, trying to eat really healthy foods because typically that's easier, and eating protein and carbs together so that you're nourishing your body, and just even if it's enough to keep you moving in the right direction, you'll have small wins because you'll feel like, I did this yesterday. I was able to eat, healthy, balanced amount of food. And I've worked with a family where they really wanted their daughter to eat ice cream. That was really important to them. But ice cream's not healthy anyway, so that's not a small win. That's a huge leap for someone who doesn't want to eat anything, never mind something that's unhealthy. So a lot of families are like that because they just want their kiddo to be, healthy and have a healthy relationship with food. But there's lots of scaffolding that's needed to go from no food to ice cream. You really want to go from no food to, nuts and apple slices. Again, apples are healthy. Okay, so celebrate the small wins. When you're successful, You really need to celebrate. And I've had families recently in the office that were telling me that they were celebrating D's. And that's because their child was getting F's. Their kiddo with an ADHD brain pattern was getting F's, and they forgot about a test and got a D. And I'm like, you got to celebrate it, because at least you passed this time instead of failed like they would have done in the past. Okay, if you'd like more information, my new website, my personal website, drtrishleigh.com, is up and running, and I really love what the web developer did with it. My office website is Leigh, Brain, and Spine. There's tons of information there, and there's a page on eating disorder. And if you're from a different office across the country, you've been referred to this webinar from your neurofeedback expert, go to their website and see what information they have, or contact them and they'll get you more information. Okay, so let me see if we have some questions. We have a question about insurance. Different providers will interact with insurance differently. Typically, it's not covered that well, I will tell you. So what we do is we give people the codes to check with their insurance company before they work with us, so they know how much reimbursement that they will get. And sometimes people are pleasantly surprised, but many times it's an out-of-pocket expense. But it is very, very important. We have another really great question about ADHD medications and then how that impacts eating. And it's an awesome question, because ADHD and anxiety are so highly, let me just stop sharing my screen here, are so highly related that a lot of times stimulant medication makes it very difficult for kids to eat. But it's not naturally induced. It's literally because they don't have any appetite. It suppresses their appetite. So that is a side effect of the medication. It doesn't work the same in terms of the stress response that happens in the brain, but it really just makes it difficult for them to eat. Let me see. Oh, and another, keep making it big, another thought is about gluten-free diets and having elimination diets too. So in our office at Leigh, Brain, and Spine, we provide food sensitivity testing for those people that are interested. Many doctors across the country offer this type of testing also. And what it will show is if there's sensitivity to any food in that person's diet, sometimes those sensitivities can really impact the way that a person feels after they eat. So it will kind of give them a little bit of a stress response. Again, not the exact same mechanism that happens in anorexia or in compulsive eating, but more like, you know, if you know there's a food that you don't feel well after you eat it, then a lot of times there'll be more and more aversions to eating. So that can create challenges too for people. So that's something that we will look into. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up. Thanks again for joining me tonight. This is really important stuff. And like I always say, you have to control your brain or it will control you. And if you have challenges surrounding food and eating, then it's definitely controlling you to some aspect. So get into your neurofeedback expert's office, get your brain map, and find out what it needs so it can perform and feel better, so you can get over this and move on with a healthy relationship with food. Okay, thanks again for joining me. Have a great night.